There's this balance of compliance and free thinking that's really hard to strike. How I parent is focused on, I want my kids to decide things for themselves. I want them to use their own judgment. I want them to do things not because I said it's right, but because it's aligned with their values. And of course, that runs into problems when the 6-year-old's values are eating candy for breakfast and staying up until midnight. But I do emphasize that a lot. And often the conflict we're getting at school is where the kids are exercising too much self determination and autonomy for what the teacher would like.
All right. I'm Laura Forcum, president of the Independence Center and a former marketing professor.
I'm Lauren Hall, professor of political science and author of the Substack, The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life.
This is We Made This Political, a podcast about making politics more about flourishing and less about power.
We talk about living together in families, communities, and as citizens, drawing from our backgrounds in psychology and political science, and as parents. We are live. Hey, Laura, how are you?
Good, Lauren. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Right before we went live, we were just talking about the standard chaos of summer with kids and back to school.
Yes.
We were talking about what we could do for this live. We don't have guests for today. And so we wanted to sort of dig in a little bit to some of the stuff that we are interested in, which is this intersection of sort of independent thinking, but also politics and parenting. Laura suggested doing a back to school episode, which I really loved. We have some thoughts, but we would love to hear from those of you who have joined and talk about where we're seeing intersections between the current political climate, modern education, but also some practical back to school tips. Maybe we have some that are useful.
Mhm.
No, we're not offering advice.
Well, I will tell you the things I've tried that have been a mistake in retrospect. And you
yeah.
can learn from my experience.
Yeah, good. Well, that's what
So,
So, Laura, you and I are both on very different school schedules. Your kids went back this week. Is that
they
true?
went back Tuesday. Yes, we go back very early lately here in South Carolina. So they've now had 4 days. Well, this is the fourth day of school. And I was thinking about, I don't know if you remember this commercial. It's an old commercial at this point, but it's that song, It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year. And the parents are pushing their carts down the aisle at like Staples or something. They're just thrilled and the kids are disconsolate. That's largely what it's been like in my house. But I love how pliable school makes children because they're tired. It's like a container of children that I think we didn't realize fully the value of it until COVID and not having schools.
After you suggested this episode topic, I was actually thinking like all the different like weird parallels between parenting and politics. It's actually not really surprising, right? In both cases, it's like humans living together, right? Like the same problems, like humans living together have the same problems across different kinds of spaces. But yours reminded me, or your last comment reminded me of the difficulty in our home with transitions, transition from one activity to another, transition from like one season to another. And some of it's just like the basic organization of transitions, but then there's also a lot of emotions that tend to come up around transitions. What does your back to school look like in your space, either your family or broadly?
Well, I was thinking about this from the framework of traits we're trying to cultivate in our parenting and among our children that are not always great for school life, or at least that's how I look at it. Like there's this balance of compliance and free thinking that's really hard to strike. And I feel like how I parent is really focused on I want my kids to decide things for themselves. I want them to use their own judgment. I want them to do things not because I said it's right, but because it's aligned with their values. Of course, that runs into problems when the 6-year-old's values are eating candy for breakfast and staying up until midnight. I do emphasize that a lot. often the conflict we're getting at school is where the kids are exercising too much self-determination and autonomy for what the teacher would like. And I
Mhm.
also think we're doing this in the larger macro environment of South Carolina, which has some traditional thinking about how kids relate to authority, the kind of deference kids show for adults. That's an interesting mix too, right? Because you probably don't want to raise your kids to have a culture that's vastly different from the area in which you live. On the other hand, I'm not going to make my kids say yes or no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, which is still pretty common here in the South. I
Yep.
didn't grow up doing that because my parents, I grew up in North Carolina. My parents were not practitioners of yes or no, sir, even back in the day, and they're pretty traditional. So it's a challenge because I feel like I'm creating a household culture that's different than the school culture. And sometimes those things butt up against
Mhm.
each other.
I have two things that I think we could dig into. One is the systems that you and I have been thinking about, like the pros and cons of systems, trade offs, which is something I talk about a lot. But then the other one is norms. And I really want to get into
Hmm.
that because I have a lot of complicated feelings about norms and how we teach kids about like both the importance of norms, but also the importance of being able to resist norms. Or those are things I've been thinking about a lot. To get to the systems point, I have very ambivalent feelings about school. I had a very ambivalent, like, school experience. I didn't really enjoy it, but I mean, I got along. I wasn't bullied or anything. It was fine, but I didn't love school. The more that I do research, I have a background in evolutionary biology, and so the more that I, like, read up on, like, childhood development and the kinds of things that, like, humans like, the environments humans would have grown up in over, like, thousands of years, like, school's, like, absolutely bizarre, and I really love the work of Peter Gray, a wonderful developmental psychologist who focuses on the importance of play and particularly unsupervised or structured play where adults aren't refereeing and directing like children and how to do things. So for me, my kids go to public school. I have really ambivalent feelings about the whole school setup. I have three very active kids and they spend 8 hours a day in a classroom.
Hmm.
It's not eight, but six. We just have weird issues in our school. Recess is 20 minutes long and like lunch is 20 minutes long. So like there's been all of these pressures from national, regulations, the Department of Ed, but also state level regulations on schools. That means that it's harder and harder to allow kids that space to do any kind of unstructured play. And then we add in that we have kids with some neurodivergence. We've got kids with that is another element where we're forcing this particular kind of brain into like a system that like the brain is not really like kids'
Hmm.
brains in general aren't well suited for this. And then my kid's brain in particular is really poorly suited for this.
Hmm.
So I have all these like really hard, like, for me it's, but at the same time, I would be a terrible homeschooling parent. Maybe will homeschool. And then I realized I am not that parent. I can't do it. I would lose my mind. So I don't know. It's all these, I think there's a lot of satisficing that goes on where we're like,
Hmm.
let's find something we can live with. We have very good public schools. My kids have good friends, but there's always that wrinkle in the back of my head of shoving kids into the system. And I'm shoving my kids into the system that I really don't think is built for them. I'm sure, you have very similar thoughts. Laura's and our kids are almost the exact same age,
Hmm.
right? So
13, 10, and 6.
yeah, almost exactly. So we have 12, 10, and 7. So they're all in that same space. Anyway, I don't know if you have any thoughts on the systems piece. I think a lot about centralization and standardization and how they're necessary for modern life because bureaucracies do things really well, but then they also,
I wrote a Substack article a couple weeks ago where I talked about bureaucracy being dehumanizing. I sort of envision that as a two-piece article because the first piece of it is, yes, for bureaucracies, including school, there's a certain amount of dehumanization that has to happen because we need to treat all these kids pretty much the same. One of the benefits of bureaucracy is that it doesn't let people use their personal relationships to get things that other people can't access. And within a school setting, again, there's tension here. My kids might get treated really well or really poorly if we're talking about things that are just based on relationships, right? Like I have a daughter who's very smart, very self-directed, does tests and does well at school, pushes herself to excel, is the ideal student, right? I have
Mhm.
another kid that is the total opposite of that. And so it's like if school was just based on interacting with our kids based on who they are, I can envision that going really well or really poorly. And so that's where the value of the bureaucracy comes in. It says we're going to do our best to standardize treatment, throwing out what they know about who I am as a parent, right? And like how my household is run, and that they can trust me when I say my kids miss school for valid reasons. Right.
Yep.
And so that's the
Yep.
piece of that I didn't grapple with very fully in the newsletter, which is it would be great if all of our bureaucratic relationships were small and personal enough so that everybody could be treated as an individual and there's no unfairness. But I
Yeah.
think that's probably just impossible, right? Like that's a pipe dream. I don't think there's a structure of modern society where that's possible. So
Yeah.
then you are kind of talking about mitigating the effects of your kid spending 6 of their 12 to 14 waking hours in a setting that's institutional and not designed for them. And in a lot of ways, designed for the convenience of teachers and administrators rather than what's really good for kids. I know you spoke to Xander Kegg from The Third Way on his podcast
Yeah.
recently. I talked to him too. And one of the things that he mentioned that is coming to mind for me is this ability that I want my kids to have, which is to navigate systems in an effective way and not be like, oh, my highest and best value in life is to be a great student, right? Because that's not long term useful. But also not be like, I'm going to show these people every chance I get that they're not the boss of me. That's not helpful either. So it's this balance of can you navigate school and other circumstances where you find yourself? And that's going to include a lot of self control, putting greater overarching goals ahead of your more instantaneous goal to do whatever you want. Like that navigating process, I think, is the skill I'm trying to cultivate in my kids.
So Mike, a really great comment that I think fits the systems piece really well too, which is like, so human community is obviously like there's lots of different values and those values conflict with each other. And so part of what I think we have to, and this is where I think the school setting, I've tried to be really honest with my kids where there's certain things that we do simply because we are part of a community. If it obviously conflicts deeply with our values as human beings, that's a different question. But if it's just a matter of conforming ourselves because this is what you have to do to be part of a human community, whether that's a family or a school, I want them to understand that there's a trade-off. So it's not about pure conformity for the sake of conformity, but it's also not about pure rebellion for the sake of rebellion. Now that I'm a university administrator, I'm the man in the system, right? I'm the bureaucracy in a big way. I have some faculty that I run into who just like, their like theme song is like whatever that like classic song is from Rage Against the Machine. I'm like, guys, I understand. I loved Rage Against the Machine. I also listened to Nine Inch Nails when I was in my teens. But the reality is that we work in a bureaucracy and higher education is a huge bureaucracy controlled by other bureaucracies. So at some point, you also have to think about how you fit into the system and how you can make it better in a meaningful way. It's the fact that I like people with PhDs who don't quite get that is, anyway, but I think your term navigating, which is a word I like to use a lot, is like helping kids like become sort of like orienteers in their own life, like giving them the toolkit so they can navigate conflicts of values and figure out how to rank their own values. But it's not going to be a stagnant ranking, right? Like you're going to in some situations, your values are like some values are going to rise to the top and others are going to fall below. And that's what I just want them to be really cognizant of when that's happening. So they're not just doing whatever someone in authority told them to do.
Yeah. In my house, I feel like I may be doing an extreme version of this parenting, but this is the conversation we have about curse words. At home, I really don't care. You're not allowed to curse at siblings, right? Like, you can't curse at people, but you also can't say regular words that are unkind at people. Like, it's not about curse words. When we're talking about what you're allowed to say, you got to choose. If you want to say those words, if you want to quote somebody around your grandfather, that will have consequences. You can think about what those are. I'm not going to tell you. I'm not saying that I'm doing this because I have a very wise view of parenting. This is just sort of what feels right to me. It has absolutely gone wrong. So please don't take this as an endorsement. But it's the same at school, right? You can say those words if you want. Here's probably what it'll look like, and then you decide. It is that kind of flexibility to say, will conforming here get me other things that are important to me, like being in community, like having academic achievement. So I have access to other educational settings, which is one of the things my oldest kid is starting to think about. Does this feel like there's a larger value at stake? My oldest kid has definitely come home and said, I can't stand that teacher. She is really unkind to students. I've seen her be unkind, unthoughtful, and unfair. And he's lost total respect. Can you address that in your role as a student, or how can you address that?
One of the things I see my students not being able to do is they really struggle with context shifting. And I think part of this is the result of probably a combination of overparenting. My colleague Steve Horowitz wrote a wonderful paper that I'll link to in the show notes looking at the role of unsupervised play and helping kids understand how there's different rules in different contexts. And we have a lot of kids on the spectrum at my school. Kids on the spectrum often have trouble understanding different contexts and when rules apply because it's like a really tricky thing. It's a very nuanced, like you move into a different group of people and the rules are slightly different. The expectations are slightly different. But I do want my kids to be able to understand that. And I think part of that is just calling it out, making it explicit. We have these rules at home. You're going to a friend's house. That friend's parents are going to have different rules. The expectation is that you follow those rules. If you're uncomfortable following their rules, then you come back home. You don't get to break their rules and their rules. Like you come back home and that's a decision that you make. And maybe that means you don't hang out with that friend anymore. But that's your choice. You don't get to dictate what other people's rules are. And so there is this kind of balance between challenging unjust rules or pushing back against rules that aren't justified, but also recognizing that other people get to set rules too, like other people in their domain. And you don't just get to go into other people's spins and say, like, I think this is a dumb rule. You can think that, but you don't get to act on it. And you don't get to tell them what their role should be in their space. So helping kids do that kind of like, it's deeply political. And this is why, as a political theorist, I'm really interested in the process and how kids learn. In a lot of ways, learning norms and rules and laws is a lot like language, right? You're learning how you arrange words for different contexts and for different reasons. I think rule making is really similar. It's like an instinctive action, but you learn how to do it through practice over time. I've been trying to call that out with my kids and make sure that they see how it's happening. My goal isn't to direct them. It's to say, here's how you should think about the process of rulemaking and rule following. You're going to have to adjust yourself to different contexts. Like you're going to have, like the rules at school are different than the rules at your after school program. And you need to understand how to navigate those. And that, I think, is something my students really struggle with. They've been in very controlled environments where they're told what the rules are. You go to a refereed sports game, it's very controlled. You know what the rules are. You don't have to think about it. And then you go home and you have these rules, and then you go to school and you have these rules. Whereas when we were growing up, I was in tons of uncontrolled environments, like just riding my bike around town or doing whatever. Like there was a lot of negotiation and context switching. I had to figure out myself what the rules of the game were in all these different environments. And I didn't do it very well. I had a lot of social anxiety as a result. For me, it was hard to do. But I think that practice is really important. I probably could have benefited from more guidance. We were 80s and 90s kids, so this was not what our parents offered. They're like,
I mean, the difference too in the unstructured play opportunities are just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know if I wonder if there's a regional difference between where you live and where I live. One of the things that's really striking about rural, suburban South Carolina life is there is a perception that there's a lot of danger, even in this small town. And so when I wanted my daughter to walk 1, 2, 3 blocks to her theater class after school, that was met with complete disbelief. They said, no, of course you can't do that. That's not safe. And I was like, this is an almost 10-year-old. She can't walk 3 blocks, right? My son walks a little bit further sometimes home from school. It's about 3/4 of a mile. He is the only student in 2 grades of the middle school who walks. Some of that is that schools are set up for car drop off. Some of that, I think, is safety perceptions. The idea that kids are just going to hang out together and play after school seems to be a foreign idea in this area. Everything is very structured. And like you were saying, when I was growing up, after school was a time when I was hanging out with friends. I was not at home. I was off doing my own thing. with a very loose idea on my parents' part of where I was at any given moment. Now, I think parents can't imagine the idea that you would like not know very specifically
Yeah.
where your child is, like down to 20 or 30-foot radius.
Very similar here in the Northeast. And we actually, it's interesting. I'm on this very large mom group for our kind of, it's like, it's for our town. It has like a couple thousand members. And it's actually like pretty civil as like Facebook groups go. This comes up all the time, the question of how safe the environment is. We live in one of the safest towns in the nation. The worst crime we usually get is someone stealing a Hyundai or a Kia, like car thefts, like that kind of stuff. Violent crime, like almost unheard of unless it's like domestic violence, right? But like there's very, very little violence. So whereas like 5 miles down the road in inner city Rochester, very high murder rate, but like it's almost always drug related. So, but we live on this kind of weird property. You can look down the hill and see the elementary school.
Nice.
We had to fight with not like it was like a gentle fight, but like my husband fortunately is much more assertive on some of the stuff than I probably would have been. But he was just like, no, our kids are walking to school. And the principal's like, no, you can't. Like you either like, so if either the bus would have to pick them up to drive them like 500 yards or we'd have to walk them to school. And my husband was like, we're just not doing this. And then fortunately COVID hit and there was this huge bus driver shortage. And then all of a sudden our interests aligned and we were like, hey, we're doing you a favor by not having our kids bused, but also we're just not doing this. And so my husband, he sort of like gave them like a sort of ultimatum where he's like, I'm just not going to pick up my kids. They can walk home. They will be together. They're very safe. First of all, you can't do anything if I send my kids to school unaccompanied. They're just going to walk to school. And then I don't know what you're going to do when we don't come and pick them up. And they said, sure. The school, fortunately, like he wasn't rude about it. We'd been having this conversation for 2 years. They knew our family. Going back to this humanizing bureaucracies, they were like, okay, you can let your kids walk to school. But the fact that it took this much in the safest spaces when we can literally watch them down the hill into the building is crazy. In contrast, I think about my dad when my grandfather did a sabbatical in Japan and my father and his younger brother would take the subway in Japan. They were in Sendai to this international elementary school across town. They didn't speak the language. They would just get on this train. They were 7 and 5 or something. They were schlepping around Japan by themselves. And nobody thought anything of it. Now, of course, you would lose your mind. The Lenore Skenazy origin story of free range kids was letting her 8-year-old ride the subway in New York by himself. He wanted to show that he was independent. And she got death threats. People called the police on her. It was because she wrote about it in the New York Times and people were like, you are a terrible mother. And she was like, interesting. But then other people's response was really positive. So it's this very polarizing issue, whether we let kids have the kind of independence that we had when we were kids, even though the violent crime rate's lower, child abductions are lower. We have a better idea of where sex offenders are. It's safer for our kids to be alone now than it ever was before. But culturally, we can't get over that.
We have these very vivid exemplars of crimes that happen to children, and they are highly reported on because they are so unusual. The problem is almost everybody can call to mind an example of a horrific, random crime that targeted a child. And the vast majority of those instances are abductions happening within family, right? Just like violence overall tends to not be random. But yet the examples that are most vivid to us are the worst ones, but they're also incredibly unlikely. This is an issue of human statistical reasoning, which is actually statistical intuition is very poor. Even among statisticians, there's some really interesting papers where they've gone and surveyed people at statistics conferences on questions about base rates, because that's like really the biggest fallacy, right? That we just all fall victim to all the time. We misunderstand the prevalence of random events and misunderstand randomness. And the end result is your kid can't walk to school. We tend to look at that as though protecting kids has no downside. Like it's all upside. It's like, oh, but at least nothing happened. And that's not true. There is a downside. It's just hard for us to spot especially in individual kids, but you're starting to see it in the population. You have a lot of kids who have really low senses of agency, really high anxiety.
Yeah.
I was just talking to somebody recently about this. There's a German American psychologist who came up with the theory of the good enough mother. His name's it's either Kohut or Kohut. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. I've heard both. And the good enough mother says that actually it's your failures as a parent that make space for your kids to grow into greater levels of capability. One of the first things that little kids start to realize is that they can deceive their parents. This is actually a really important thing for them to learn because they realize that the parent is not all knowing and perfect. I think we've designed parenting and schools to some extent with the expectation that parents and teachers don't fail. They provide the perfect, nurturing information environment, and then we don't scaffold up kids' ability to do things for themselves, whether it's navigate the path to school, pick up a grocery we need in the middle of dinner prep, solve problems for themselves. Like we just don't do it because we can do it better than they can. But the cost is these are very anxious kids who then don't feel prepared. I know you've seen this as an administrator. I saw it as a college professor. These are kids who have not been asked to problem solve on their own behalf. And they are missing some skills that I think is reasonable to expect from an 18 to 22-year-old.
Yep. Yeah. The one I wanted to add to your base rate problem is that part of what we have right now is so many cognitive biases pushing in the wrong direction. In addition to not understanding base rates and the patterns of risk, we have this really powerful negativity bias. The only stories that we hear are the really bad ones. We don't hear the millions of stories of kids getting home from school safely because there's no reason to report on those. But then also cognitively, we hang on to negative experiences and negative stories much more. They're much more sticky. That means if you're a parent, your brain immediately goes to the worst case scenario because that's what your brain is wired to do, right? Yeah. Well, a lot of it is us training ourselves to push back thoughtfully on what feels right. I've felt this in situations where my kids wanted to walk to the playground by themselves. And like my two youngest, they don't have cell phones. We have a Gab watch that only periodically works because we often can't find the charger. So I'm sending two kids without any way of contacting us. That would be totally normal, like 20 years ago. But my initial feeling is one of anxiety. I'm like, well, what would happen if something happened? I have to push back on that and say, okay, talk yourself out of this more. What does the social scientist think about? And it's hard. And so I understand why a lot of parents don't have the time or bandwidth to do that kind of thing. It's just easier to be like, no, because I don't have the ability to do this. This is also, by the way, I'll just add, really socioeconomically, like there's a huge polarity there. When we lived in the city, there were little gangs of children, like starting at 5 to 8, who would just roam around the streets in our city neighborhood. I actually loved seeing them at the playground by themselves. The older kids kind of kept an eye on the younger kids, but there was no expectation that they would be constantly they didn't have fancy phones or watches. The expectation was that they were kind of in the community being watched by the community. And that's because their parents didn't have the luxury of freaking out about where they were all the time, right? Like their moms were working like 2 shifts and trying to figure out how to get dinner. So there is also this anxiety luxury that we have as upper class suburban parents that is not shared by.
I think you'd write that article. I love luxury anxiety. I think you should write more about that because that's really helpful.
There's a couple people, I don't remember the other guy's name, but Musa El-Garbi has this really great book, We Have Never Been Woke, where he talks about how a lot of DEI language and so he's actually pro diversity, he's a Black man. This is not a person who's anti-DEI, but the way that a lot of people approach DEI, especially upper class white people, it's like a luxury that they can have that other people can't have. And so he talks about symbolic capitalists and that university administrators and professors can dabble in DEI in symbolic ways without actually having to do the work of getting dirty on the ground and figuring out how to solve problems. And so he's very critical of that. Jonathan Haidt has talked about this in The Anxious Generation, that this luxury of anxiety is something we only see in higher socioeconomic groups. His name, I'll try to find it and put it in the show notes, but he's made similar arguments. He came from a much lower socioeconomic background, like first gen student, and went to Princeton. He was astonished at how much there was this luxury of anxiety. These kids could freak out about the smallest things because they didn't have to worry about where they were going to sleep that night. They didn't have to worry about whether they were going to have enough food. Like they didn't have to worry about their jobs. And so there is a kind of like perniciousness to like, if you like there's amazing things about being financially secure, but I think it does allow us to kind of hyper focus on other kinds of, actually my physician mentioned this when I was pregnant with my first, she said, one of the things that's kind of, we focus so much on like the maternal mortality crisis, which the US has higher rates of maternal mortality than other developed countries, but it's still astonishingly rare. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to save mothers' lives, of course. And a lot of those are preventable. By focusing so much on it, we actually ramp up anxiety. You get these mothers who are freaking out about having half a glass of wine, or whether they ate enough kale during their pregnancy, or like, did they stress out too much? Because stress is bad for the baby too. You can't stress out pregnant mothers about their failures and then tell them that stress is bad for the baby. It's a doom loop. I think the anxiety, like the sort of luxury of that kind of anxiety is good.
I think what's important to say, it's not like you're less anxious because you literally don't have time. But I wonder if for kids, part of what's happening is because you've been asked to take on more responsibility, you have a greater sense of agency is what's countering anxiety. So I'll say in my family, I'm a divorced mom of 3. My kids help around the house because I need them to. I don't have a co-parent in the house with me and I work. And so it's like, no, I need you to empty the dishwasher. I need you to put away groceries. I need you to put away your laundry. We're a family and we're all responsible for running the house together. They're actually really happy to help and they do it without being asked. And I think that feeling of contributing and being needed is really important. At first, I did do a better job of emptying the dishwasher than they did. But you know what? They've come a long way. I can live with it.
Figure it out. Yeah.
Right. And so I think that feeling of like, hey, I can solve problems is actually the best antidote we have to kids feeling anxious. It comes from a good place, certainly, of like, hey, I don't want my kid to have to do chores. I want my kid to be free to enjoy their childhood. I don't want to have to ask them to do stuff. But it's also really good for them. This is the escalating scaffolding process of going from being a passive person within the household to somebody who's eventually going to run their own household.
Yeah. Same thing with first jobs. I remember I was babysitting a newborn when I was 11 years old. Passed the Red Cross babysitting exam. And then a neighbor across the street handed me her newborn. Thankfully, it all worked out. I don't think I would have handed my newborn to an 11-year-old. There was a lot more trust back then. My 12-year-old can't find people who are willing to let her. She really wants to have a job. She wants to babysit. And now you can find people who are willing to have a 12-year-old as a mother's helper. So if the parent's home, that's okay. But I do think there's a really important element of realizing that you are the only one who can solve this problem. There's no one else to call. And that's what a lot of my college students don't have. When I was still in the classroom, I would get these emails from students about things they could have solved by Googling. Right? But I think they're just so used to someone else, like, who do I ask to solve this problem? Whereas if you give kids jobs, like if they have a newspaper route, which kids do not have anymore, but back in the day when kids had a newspaper route, if it's 5 a.m. and you have a problem, you have to figure out how to solve it because you're the only person out there and you don't have a cell phone. I don't know what we do about that because we live in a totally different world and so much of kid stuff is online. But I do wish there was a way to scaffold more of that. I mean, I think some parents are getting excited about that's why Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts are still kind of powerful because they give kids that opportunity. This is something I think we've really cut off a lot of opportunities for young people to scaffold their skills in a meaningful way.
Michael's raising that point about your 12-year-old can't find a job. My 13-year-old can't find a job. I asked around this summer if he could volunteer in the area where we live. We live in a really small town with a small downtown where he could walk to several different places and do some volunteer work. He was less excited about this idea than me, but I didn't get any takers for him. Even saying, here's some free labor, I can't find stuff for him to do. Nobody's going to hire a 12-year-old to babysit. I hire college kids to babysit. I think that's complicated and hard to solve as well.
Leaders in student life yesterday. And one of the things that I think there's real political implications here too. One of the problems we have, not to go down my usual polarization rabbit hole, but we know that like families are now like assortative mating is an increasing problem. It's more common now for you to marry within your political party than within your religion. So kids get the same political messaging at home. And then they're not exposed to different political messages when they don't have to go to a workplace where somebody's ranting about Trump or Biden. They don't have to navigate that because they don't have a job. In school, there aren't very many spaces for kids to talk about politics, broadly speaking, but not just politics, like differences in general. I mean, I just think kids are not thrown into environments where they have to navigate differences of opinions and differences of perspectives without parental oversight. Like all of the situations that they find themselves in are controlled. So they come to college and they can't figure out what to do if they disagree with their roommate about something. They have no conflict resolution skills. And obviously, this is a broad brush. Some kids are still capable of doing this, but a lot of them aren't. And so our student life staff member was mentioning that like the number of interventions that they're requested to make has escalated dramatically. Kids will like email the president about like roommate issues. Like they have like no sense of like who they should be talking to.
Yeah.
Things. But then also the number of things, like one example that she gave was like, they'll get complaints about like a flyer on campus. And she's like, what would you like us to do about this flyer? You would like the ability to hang flyers for something that you care about? Like trying to get them to think about this problem as opposed to just, I don't like that flyer. Someone should take it down and that should be you. They're not talking to other people. They're not doing any kind of conflict management. They're not figuring out how to navigate conflict. So this goes back to that issue of navigation, right? Like you learn how to navigate landscapes, you learn how to orienteer, you learn how to hike because you practice doing it and you practice the skills like using a compass and stuff. But we're not doing any of that for students in the social, emotional, political space. We're going to take you from these bubbles where everyone has the same beliefs and values that you've been totally structured. And then we're going to drop you into a place like the workplace. Good luck. Right. It's not surprising that they actually can't handle that at all.
And I think too, to see, and we've touched on this sometimes before in our conversations, the ability to see that not every space has to be politicized. In some places, we would like to come together regardless of our agreement about questions of politics or certain cultural issues, and that it's worth it to come together without being totally in agreement. And so it's, I think that is a really tricky thing. I don't quite know how to trace the development of these really ideologically homogenous spaces, but it's sort of like there's this expectation that we all have to agree, and that if you disagree, it's because you're a bad person and we should exclude you from the space, right? I'm not sure what we do about recreating that, because it's not just kids and college students that are struggling with that. I think we see it in a lot of places. I do think like among older people, or especially in business settings where trade and commerce is happening, then you have a reason to set aside your differences and work. I wonder if we will lose that as younger generations don't have the skill set for setting aside conflict and agreeing to disagree, or having tools to work through disagreements and find common ground.
This is really relevant in the higher ed space, but I also think it's really relevant in like the parenting space, which is I think we struggled for a long time. When I was younger, the expectation was that you just grinned and bore it. Like like if you were uncomfortable in the situation, like either that was your fault or you just like sucked, like you just, and especially as a young woman, I internalized a lot of that. For me, speaking up when I was uncomfortable was really hard. The expectation, and I don't think it was my parents like being terrible parents. They were just like, it was the norm at the time, was just like, you adapt yourself to this situation, right? And so I think there's been a useful push against that, which is you do have the right to set boundaries over what happens to your body, for example, or what happens in your personal relationships, specific safe spaces where, like I understand how my Black students might want a space where race is not something they have to debate or think about. They can just go to this space and be around people who have similar kinds of values and goals, right? Where I think it's become really concerning is the idea that the safe space then should be everything. So the idea that you carve out safe spaces is really important. We actually try to do this at home with my kids. If you need a space to go back to your room and sit in your bed and just be without other human beings bothering you, to be able to do that. Carve out the space, have a boundary, be alone. But that can't be the whole world, right? This goes back to the point at the beginning, which was you don't get to set the rules for other people's spaces. Trying to convince students that is the problem I see with a lot of my students, mostly progressive students, partially because my conservative students are so quiet that they never actually speak up most of the time. A lot of my students will say a classroom should be, for example, like anti-fascist, or it should be like, I want a classroom that is whatever, like takes a position on Gaza because otherwise I won't feel safe in that classroom. And I'm like, that's insanity. A classroom is a specific type of safe space in the sense that Jacob Levy actually has some nice stuff on this. It's a safe space for intellectual exploration. You can't attack people for their beliefs. You can't engage in ad hominem attacks, right? So this goes back to like your kids' use of swear words, right? You can use them in some context, but you can't aim them at other people. Every space has its rules. That's not to say the world is a free-for-all, but you don't get to dictate what those rules are. And they shouldn't be dictated based on your ideological views. And that's what like so many of my students are like, well, in order for me to feel safe, I need people to agree with X, Y, or Z. And I'm like, that's not how it works. And also, let's take some of that away. Like when you go to the library, you shouldn't have to choose between Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter. You should just be able to go to the library. That should just be a space for books.
One idea that comes from Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff in their book, The Coddling of the American Mind, is this idea of anti-fragility. And I think that's a really helpful idea for thinking about parenting, because basically the point they're making is some things are fragile, right? If you drop a teacup, it will break because it's fragile. Some things are the opposite of that, and stress actually strengthens them. They're talking about like bones and tendons and ligaments are made stronger through use. If you keep those wrapped in cotton, they will become more and more fragile. I think it's the same with kids where they have felt that by not having emotional or intellectual stress in their lives, that is what makes them safe, when really it's the ability to contend with those things that creates a sense of agency and safety. And that's not to say we should let them practice being in environments where it's deeply stressful and anxiety producing for them. But it is a question of learning to navigate those things. And if we're not giving them opportunities to interact with people they disagree with or to hear viewpoints that differ strongly from their own, I think we are creating this sort of fragility. While it might seem like keeping kids calm and free from anxiety is the best way to parent them, it turns out that it's actually the ability to grapple with those things that is the real skill that you need.
Yeah. Well, and I wish we thought more about parenting like I think most people understand intuitively, like athletic coaching. You wouldn't, if you take someone who's sedentary and force them to run a marathon, they will get seriously hurt. They might die, right? Because their body is not conditioned for that. But we know that the solution to that problem is not just leading a sedentary life forever, because that has other dangers like death and cardiovascular disease.
It's a U-shaped curve, right? The extremes are bad.
But we do have to be really thoughtful about how we scaffold these experiences and help students and kids work through lower level stressors so that they can then handle the higher level stressors when they get to them. Because we are not going to be in a position to know what those stressors are. We're not going to be in a position to predict like what they're going to be confronting. We actually want to do as much training as we can when we have them, because eventually they're not going to be able to come to us to say, how do I manage this? They're going to have to figure it out themselves. We're almost at time. Honestly, if anyone from the audience wants to weigh in, but we can do our usual, Laura. I can almost guess that you're feeling good about school being back, but what else are you feeling optimistic about week?
So we just came back from a week-long beach vacation. I think we're reaching the age of civility where we can sit at a restaurant mostly quietly without any screens. And so I just kind of like noticed that at the vacation that like
Nice.
we've sort of I feel like we've turned a corner in a lot of ways. It was a really good time to connect with the kids before the start of school. I feel happy about it and also a little tired because vacations are hard.
My sister, and I don't think it was actually her original line, just shared it together. There's like a joke somewhere that started on the internet, though. There are no vacations as parents, only
Mhm.
trips. And I think that's a good reminder to level set your expectations. This is going to be really tiring, but it'll be good. Our kids are still a month out before they start again. The Northeast starts so much later. It's crazy. We also have this weird gap between when there's no camps or anything available because the college students have gone back to college, but public schools haven't started yet. That's always the week where all the faculty bring their kids to campus because nobody knows what to do with them. So we're kind of trying to figure out that. What I'm doing right now, and this is the first year that I'm doing it, sounds a little OCD or type A, which is not my usual style, but I'm really looking forward to it. Our campus actually has a full semester calendar that's like a big, and I'm actually going to like this year for the first time, I'm going to label like all the half days, all of the days that the kids have off school, all the weird superintendent's days or like student conference days. Because what happens every year is that we get into the mix of the semester and things get really crazy. And then all of a sudden we realize tomorrow there's no school and we did not plan for it. So I'm feeling mildly optimistic about this year, the schedule written down in a visible place. I know it's like a very small baby step, but I'm feeling good about it.
I have hope for you.
Thank you. So. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And this was awesome, Laura. I think we should turn this into like a Substack post or something.
Oh, that's a great
We
idea.
touched on a lot of good things.
Happy back to school, everybody.
Enjoy the next month without children. Happy Friday, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to We Made This Political with Laura Forcum and Lauren Hall. You can find us on Substack, Instagram, or LinkedIn. The podcast Substack is We Made This Political. Laura's Substack is How to Human, and Lauren's Substack is The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life. Subscribe and share if you like what you hear, and please also rate and review on your favorite podcast platform. That really, really helps other people find our work and means a lot to us too. Thanks for listening.